Have you ever run across a puzzle so difficult that you just didn't know what to do with it? I'll tell you, that's kind of where I am today. Well, by the way, thank you for joining us today for our study of the book of Luke and Acts that we're calling Christ and His Church. I'm Steve Lusk with the Red Bank Church of Christ in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And all this year, we're looking at the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, these books in the New Testament written by Dr. Luke, that really tell us about Jesus and then about how Jesus' followers carried out his commands in his church. We're taking a chapter at a time, and today we're in Luke chapter 16. And here's where the puzzle comes in. There's a parable that's shared in Luke 16 that, I'll be honest with you, I don't really get all the nuance of it. I don't get all the meaning behind it. I don't really understand some things about it. But I do think that there are some lessons that we can learn, and let's just struggle kind of through this together today. You know, in Luke 15, Jesus tells three parables that are pretty straightforward. A parable about a lost sheep, a parable about a lost coin, and a parable about a lost son. And each of these were directed toward the Pharisees and the scribes, many of the religious leaders of the day that were condemning and accusing Jesus because he was associating with sinners. And of course, the point of each of those parables, at least one of the points of each of those parables, is just the value of one, the importance of one, and particularly one soul, one lost individual that's found, one lost item that's found. That of course, is the primary gist of those. And while there are a lot of nuances to each of those parables, they're pretty straightforward. This parable in chapter 16 is a little bit strange. Let me just read it for you. Jesus tells his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. Now, think about wasting there. Back in chapter 15, the prodigal son was wasteful. Same word is used here. This was a wasteful manager or an accountant, someone who had the charge over the master's goods. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot manage any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So this is what I'll do." He called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. Olive oil was a commodity that was widely traded. It was very valuable, used in many different applications in New Testament times. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Cut it in half, in other words." Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied, another valuable and important commodity in the ancient world. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. Again, reduce it by 20%. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. That's the parable. And just taking on its face value, I'm sitting here scratching my head and saying, man, what does this mean? But you know, here's a principle of biblical interpretation that I think we all need to remember. The Bible is its own best interpreter. And when Jesus told parables, very often he would add things to those parables that explained what he was driving at, what he was meaning, often very directly, sometimes a little bit less directly, maybe more indirectly, maybe like he did here. So what is it that Jesus is saying? He's certainly not commending dishonesty in business dealings. That's not the point. But perhaps, and of course, remember, Jesus sometimes spoke in parables so that only those who really wanted to understand would be able to understand. It's almost as if he was at times intending to be confusing for people that just didn't want to listen and didn't want to hear. But Jesus explains some things about this parable that I think we can understand. I think ultimately this parable is a parable about what we would call stewardship or wise use of our possessions. This manager had not been a faithful steward, had not been a faithful manager of dealing with the master's possessions. But when it came right down to it and he needed to take care of his future self, I don't know what I'll do. You know, I wondered, Does he have family that can take care of him? Apparently not. He's concerned about taking care of himself. So he says, I'll go to the ones that owe my master debts, and I've been taking care of those, and I will cut their debts so that they will be favorably disposed toward me, and my master will get back some of what he is owed. Seems like kind of a win-win situation for the master and for the man who's kind of in this dilemma because he's not been a good manager. And so it's kind of a win-win situation that Jesus describes here. And again, not advocating dishonest dealings or anything of the sort, but rather simply to point out that ultimately, while he had been a poor steward of things, he made a wise decision for himself going forward. And so I wonder, maybe are we the unjust stewards in that parable, that we haven't always taken care of things as we should? But if we have a long-term approach to our blessings, the things over which we've been given stewardship, that ultimately we can curry favor for eternity. Perhaps that's part of the meaning. But I do know that Jesus talks about the very fact that there's some who will have, in this context, there's some who will be given a little bit, and if they're faithful over a little bit, they'll be given more. And there'll be some that'll be given much, and if they're faithful over that, they'll be given more. But if they're unfaithful or unjust in dealing with a little bit, they won't have opportunity to be given more, and so forth. So I do believe that this is an important lesson about stewardship and how we take care of things. And then Jesus gets some feedback from the Pharisees. They apparently thought that, at least in some way, this parable was directed at them, because the Bible says that they sneered at him or scoffed at him with regard to this. Because it says the Pharisees who loved money heard this, and they were sneering at Jesus. And so Jesus says this to them. He says, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. Their priorities were all wrong. They were concerned only about what was good for them and not what God desired for them. He interjects here even a statement about the law and about the fulfillment of the law, which he was coming to do. And he uses perhaps an illustration of God's basic law about marriage and divorce. To say that it's pretty clear cut. You can either be a faithful steward of God's law in carrying out, for example, this particular law, or you can twist it and change it and not do faithfully according to what the law of God has to say with regard to this matter. And of course, Jesus doesn't deal primarily with marriage and divorce in this context. There are other contexts in which he does. Other passages in the Bible that deal with this, but I think he's simply using this as an example of the kind of thing that the Pharisees had taken and twisted because they had been unfaithful stewards of God's will. They simply wanted to do things that were pleasing to themselves. And in this context, Jesus reminds them and reminds us, no one can serve two masters. You know, that's a truism. You can't really have divided allegiance. You can't be all into one and not the other. Particularly, he talks about being devoted to one and despising the other. You can't serve both God and money or mammon, material things. There's a contradiction between the two. Now, Jesus, of course, is not condemning the fact of money. Money itself is not the problem, but it's how we deal with money, how we deal with material possessions, and I believe how we deal with all the things with which God has blessed us and entrusted to our care, like the truth of his word. And then I think he tells another parable here, another story. Some say it's a parable, some say it's a story. I don't really know for sure. It has some characteristics of a parable. It has some characteristics of a true story. But regardless, the story that Jesus tells here is about a rich man and Lazarus. He describes this rich man as being clothed with purple and faring sumptuously every day. In other words, he has everything that he needs and then some. He has been blessed materially very greatly. He contrasts that with a beggar whom he names specifically as Lazarus. Again, did he have someone individual in mind, or did he just pull that name out of the air to describe a kind of beggar like this? Every day, this beggar is brought to the gate of the rich man, and he's laid there, and And apparently every day the rich man comes and goes and completely ignores this beggar Lazarus. The time comes for both of these individuals to die. Lazarus, the Bible tells us, is taken into the comfort and blessings of Abraham's bosom, or the comfort of God's eternal welfare, in other words. The rich man finds himself in torment. And of course, the story goes on that the rich man desires for Abraham to send this guy to just dip the tip of his finger in water and touch his tongue because he's tormented in the flame. And of course, he didn't do even that much for the beggar all those years, all that time that he interacted with him or encountered him out there laid by his gate. But Abraham says, no, there's a great gulf that's fixed. There's no way that we can pass back and forth from one to the other. There may be some insights here into the afterlife, but I don't believe, again, that that's Jesus' primary message of this story. But he says, you can't do that. We can't go back and forth. He says, well, at least will you send someone back from the dead to speak to my brothers? I've got brothers back at home, and they need to know about how I've messed up and what the ultimate outcome is going to be. Please send someone back. And Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. They wouldn't listen even if someone came back from the dead if they won't believe Moses and the prophets. And again, what's that message? It is the message that the Pharisees had heard about Jesus, the coming Messiah, in Moses and the prophets throughout the Old Testament, and yet had refused to see him as he was. And in fact, of course, after Jesus rose from the dead, many of them still didn't believe. They continued to concoct stories to explain away Jesus after his resurrection from the dead. And again, I think that this is a parable about stewardship of our possessions and how we share those possessions with others, and then stewardship of the truth of God. Are we willing to listen to the truth, to hold on to it, to understand it, and then to be obedient to it, unlike or in contrast with these Pharisees that would often reject Jesus? Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. You know that some of the Pharisees, there are some instances, rare as they may be, that there were Pharisees that were sympathetic to Jesus, that were willing to listen to Jesus, like Nicodemus, for example, in John 3. There were some who did believe, and maybe secretly so, maybe reluctantly so, but they began to grasp what Jesus was saying. But the vast majority of them apparently were opposed to what Jesus was saying about who he was, about the kingdom that he came to establish, and the principles that were to guide their lives as opposed to seeking their own good. Again, it's a strange parable in the beginning of this chapter. There's some things that Jesus says in the meantime that are sometimes difficult to get our minds around to fully understand. There are some things that are even in the story of the rich man and Lazarus that cause us pause, that make us wonder what this is all about. But ultimately, I believe Jesus is reminding the Pharisees and his disciples that they were to be stewards of things that God had entrusted to them, and they were to be faithful stewards as opposed to unrighteous stewards, those who simply sought what was good for themselves rather than what was for what God wanted them to know and to understand. I hope you'll read this chapter. Maybe you see something in it that I haven't seen. Maybe you understand some things that maybe I don't understand. Do you have comments to make with regard to this? Do you have some insight that would be beneficial to others? Why don't you share that with us? Leave a comment in the comment section. Give us a call here at the Red Bank Church of Christ. Share with us your ideas. Send us an email. Send us an email at rbchoch.com. That's our email address. We'd love to hear from you with regard to your thoughts, maybe your questions further, and maybe we can delve into this more deeply. But in the meantime, let's continue to see the big picture of Jesus and his church, Christ and his church, Jesus living out, explaining, imploring with his disciples and with others concerning his message of the kingdom, and then how that was ultimately played out in the book of Acts, and then what the implications are for us. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. I hope that in some way this has been a blessing to you. Maybe I've raised more questions than I have answers, but that's really what Bible study is all about. It's about getting in there and digging in and seeking the truth and being open-minded and understanding and letting the Bible tell us what it means by using good, sound logic and reasoning, and letting the Spirit of God guide us as we attempt to understand what his will is for us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, next week we'll be looking at Acts chapter 17. If you haven't been reading along with us, you still have time to catch up. It would take you just a few minutes to catch up with the book of Luke, Luke chapter 17. I may have said Acts. Luke chapter 17, that's where we'll be next week. And you'll be more ready to discuss this and understand what's going on in this context. And certainly it will be a blessing to you no matter what. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great day.